In the vast expanse of the Arizona Territory in 1882, where dust storms could bury dreams and hope was as scarce as water in the desert, there lived stories that the wind carried but never delivered. This is one such story, about promises written in ink that faded before they could reach their destination, about love that crossed cultural boundaries in a time when such love was forbidden, and about a young Apache woman whose heart held on to hope longer than the desert holds on to rain. What happens when the only thing keeping you alive is a letter that may never come? What price does the heart pay for loving someone the world says you cannot love? And how long can hope survive when fed only by silence? Some stories are told around campfires. Others are whispered by the wind through canyon walls. This story lives in the space between what was promised and what was delivered, between two worlds that could never truly meet, and between a love so pure it defied every law written by men who believed love could be governed by the color of one's skin. This is the story of Ayanna, whose name meant eternal blossom in her native tongue, and whose heart bloomed in the most impossible of places, in love with a man whose world would never accept her, in a time when her people were fighting simply to exist. It is the story of letters written but never sent, promises made but never kept, and hope that burned bright even in the darkest of times. The desert remembers everything, they say. It remembers the tears that fell on its sand, the blood that soaked into its earth, and the dreams that were buried beneath its endless sky. But, most of all, it remembers the stories of those who loved when love was dangerous, who hoped when hope was foolish, and who waited when waiting seemed impossible. This is one such story the desert remembers. The morning sun painted the Arizona Territory in shades of gold and crimson as Ayanna made her way down to the creek that bordered the reservation lands. Her bare feet knew every rock, every root, every safe passage through the thorny brush that grew wild along the water's edge. At 19, she moved with the grace of someone who belonged to this harsh land, someone whose ancestors had walked these same paths for generations before the white man came with his fences and his laws and his promises that crumbled like sand in the desert wind. The water ran clear and cold, fed by mountain springs that never seemed to dry up even in the worst of the drought years. Ayanna knelt beside the creek, cupping the precious liquid in her hands and drinking deeply before filling the clay vessel she had brought with her. This was her daily ritual, one of the few times she could steal away from the confines of the San Carlos Apache Reservation and pretend, even for just a few moments, that the world was still the way it used to be. But the world was not the way it used to be. The year was 1882, and the Apache people had been confined to reservations for nearly a decade, their freedom stripped away by a government that saw them as obstacles to progress rather than human beings with rights and dreams and hearts that could break just like anyone else's. The reservation was a place of dust and desperation, where proud warriors who had once roamed free across vast territories now stood in lines for government rations, their spirits slowly dying along with their traditional way of life. Ayanna had been born into this new world of restrictions and regulations, but the old ways still flowed through her blood like the creek water she drank each morning. Her grandmother, Nazca, had made sure of that. In whispered conversations after dark, in songs sung in their native tongue when no government agents were around to hear, in stories passed down through generations of strong Apache women, Nazca had kept the old traditions alive in her granddaughter's heart. "Remember who you are," Nazca would tell her granddaughter as they sat by the fire, her weathered hands working on intricate beadwork that told stories without words. "Remember that you are the daughter of the wind and the sister of the stars. No piece of paper signed by white men can change what runs in your blood." It was Nazca who had given Ayanna her name, which meant eternal blossom in the Apache language. "You will bloom where others see only desert," the old woman had prophesied when her granddaughter was just 3 days old. "Your beauty will be the kind that survives drought and storm, the kind that comes from deep roots that no man can tear from the earth." Now, as Ayanna filled her water vessels in the pre-dawn silence, she wondered if her grandmother's prophecy would ever come true. It was hard to feel like an eternal blossom when you were surrounded by dust and despair, when your people were slowly forgetting their songs and their stories, when young men like her brother Joseph talked of nothing but escape and revenge against the white soldiers who had stolen their freedom. Joseph was 3 years older than Ayanna, and the anger in his heart burned as hot as the desert sun at midday. He had been old enough to remember the time before the reservation, old enough to recall what it felt like to ride free across the open plains with their father and the other warriors. The memories of that lost freedom ate at him like acid, turning him bitter and dangerous in ways that frightened Ayanna more than she cared to admit. "We are dying here," Joseph would hiss whenever they were alone together, away from the ears of their grandmother who still believed in patience and endurance. "Dying slowly, like animals in a cage. Every day we stay, we become less Apache and more like the broken dogs that beg for scraps from the white man's table." Ayanna understood her brother's anger, but she also saw something else in the reservation that Joseph's rage blinded him to. She saw children learning to read in the mission school, even if they had to speak English instead of Apache. She saw women like her friend Maria who had learned to sew white women's clothing and now earned enough money to buy extra food for her family. She saw old men like her grandfather's friend Santiago who had found ways to practice the old rituals in secret, keeping the sacred traditions alive even under the watchful eyes of the government agents. Survival, Ayanna had learned, sometimes meant bending like the desert willow in a strong wind rather than standing rigid like the mighty oak that could be broken by the same storm. It did not mean giving up who you were, but it might mean finding new ways to be who you were meant to be. It was this philosophy of quiet adaptation that had led Ayanna to the most complicated situation of her young life. 3 months ago, she had begun working in the town of Globe, just 20 miles from the reservation. The job had come through Father Mackenzie, the Irish priest who ran the mission school. He had heard that Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, needed help with her household duties, and he had recommended Ayanna for the position. "She's a good girl," Father Mackenzie had told Mrs. Henderson. "Bright, hard-working, and she speaks English better than most of the Apache children. She could be a real help to you, especially with your husband traveling so much on bank business." The job paid $2 a week, more money than most Apache families saw in a month. Ayanna would work Monday through Friday in the Henderson household, cleaning, cooking, and helping to care for the couple's 2 young children. On weekends, she would return to the reservation to be with her family and help her grandmother with the traditional women's work that kept their culture alive. It should have been a simple arrangement, beneficial to everyone involved. Ayanna would earn money that her family desperately needed, Mrs. Henderson would have reliable help with her domestic duties, and the arrangement would be seen as an example of successful Apache integration into white society. Father Mackenzie was particularly proud of the arrangement, seeing it as proof that his mission work was bearing fruit. But nothing about Ayanna's life had ever been simple, and this job would prove to be the most complicated thing that had ever happened to her. The trouble had started with Mrs. Henderson's nephew, Thomas Crawford, who had come to Globe to work in his uncle's bank while he learned the banking business. Thomas was 24 years old, fresh from college in St. Louis, and filled with ideas about progress and opportunity that seemed both exciting and dangerous to Ayanna's ears. Unlike most white men Ayanna had encountered, Thomas did not look through her as if she were invisible, nor did he speak to her in the slow, loud voice that many whites used when talking to Indians, as if being Apache automatically made her deaf or stupid. Instead, Thomas talked to her like she was a person, asking her opinions about things and actually listening to her answers. "You're not like what they told me Apache women would be like," Thomas had said during his second week in Globe, after Ayanna had served him lunch in the Henderson dining room. "What did they tell you we would be like?" Ayanna had asked, curious despite herself. Thomas had the grace to look embarrassed. "Savage, I suppose. Uncivilized. Unable to learn proper ways of living." He paused, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. "But you speak English better than half the men I went to college with, and you know things about books and ideas that surprise me. Who taught you to read so well?" "Father Mackenzie," Ayanna had replied. "And my grandmother. She may not read English, but she knows every story ever told by our people, and she taught me that stories are the same in any language. They are about people's hearts, and hearts are the same whether they beat in an Apache chest or a white chest or any other kind of chest." Thomas had stared at her for a long moment after that conversation, and Ayanna had seen something shift in his eyes, something that both thrilled and terrified her. She had seen the same look in the eyes of young Apache men when they had decided that a particular girl was the one they wanted to court. But Thomas was not Apache, and she was not white, and the world they lived in had no place for the kind of feelings that seemed to be growing between them. Still, those feelings grew stronger with each passing day. Thomas began finding excuses to be in whatever room Ayanna was cleaning, engaging her in conversations about books he had read, places he had seen, dreams he had for the future. In return, Ayana found herself sharing stories of Apache traditions, descriptions of the old ways of living, and her own dreams of finding a way to bridge the gap between her people's world and the white world that seemed determined to erase Apache culture entirely. "You're the smartest person I've met since coming to Arizona," Thomas told her one afternoon as she was polishing the silver in the Henderson dining room. "Man or woman, white or Indian, you think about things in ways that make me see the world differently." "That is dangerous thinking, Mr. Crawford," Ayana had replied, though her heart had soared at his words. "There are people who would not like to hear a white man say such things about an Apache woman." "Then, those people are fools," Thomas had said with a passion that surprised them both. "Beauty and intelligence and goodness have nothing to do with the color of a person's skin. Any man who cannot see that is blind." It was after that conversation that everything changed between them. The carefully maintained distance that Ayana had tried to keep began to crumble. When Thomas smiled at her, she found herself smiling back. When their hands accidentally touched as she served his meals, she did not pull away as quickly as she should have. When he began staying in the kitchen to talk with her as she prepared dinner, she found herself looking forward to those conversations more than anything else in her day. The situation grew more complicated when Mrs. Henderson was called away to care for her sick mother in Tucson, leaving Ayana to manage the household on her own for 2 weeks. With only Thomas and herself in the house during the day, the barriers between them began to dissolve entirely. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their childhoods, their fears, their hopes for the future. It was during the second week of Mrs. Henderson's absence that Thomas kissed her. They had been standing in the kitchen garden, examining the tomato plants that Ayana had been nurturing, when Thomas had suddenly turned to her and said, "I know this is impossible, and I know it is dangerous, but I have to tell you that I am falling in love with you." Ayana had felt her world shift beneath her feet like sand in a windstorm. She had known that her feelings for Thomas were growing beyond what was safe or wise, but hearing him speak the words aloud made everything terrifyingly real. "Mr. Crawford," she had whispered, "you cannot say such things. If anyone heard you, if anyone knew." "I know," Thomas had said, stepping closer to her. "I know all the reasons why this cannot be. I know that society would condemn us both, that your people might reject you and mine would certainly reject me. I know that loving you could destroy us both." He had reached out to touch her face gently, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "But I also know that I would rather face destruction with you than live safely without you." When he had kissed her, Ayana felt as if she were flying and falling at the same time. Every nerve in her body had come alive, every dream she had never dared to dream suddenly seemed possible. In that moment, standing in the garden with Thomas's arms around her and his lips on hers, Ayana had understood what the poets meant when they wrote about love being both heaven and hell at the same time. But understanding the danger did not make it any easier to resist. Over the remaining days of Mrs. Henderson's absence, Thomas and Ayana fell deeper into a love that they both knew was impossible. They stole kisses in empty rooms, held hands while walking in the garden after dark, and made plans that they both knew could never come to pass. "I could go back east," Thomas had said during one of their midnight conversations in the garden. "I could take you with me. In St. Louis or Chicago or New York, no one would know your background. We could build a life together far from all of this." "And what would happen to my family?" Ayana had asked, though part of her heart leaped at the possibility. "What would happen to my grandmother who raised me, to my brother who needs someone to keep him from doing something that will get him killed? I cannot abandon them for my own happiness." "Then, I will stay here," Thomas had declared. "I will find a way to make this work. Love like this is too rare to throw away because of other people's prejudices." But even as they made these impossible plans, both Thomas and Ayana knew that their time was running out. Mrs. Henderson would return soon, and with her return would come the end of their stolen moments together. Moreover, people in town were already beginning to talk about the amount of time Thomas spent at the house, about the way he looked at the Apache girl who worked for his aunt. The end came sooner and more brutally than either of them had expected. Mrs. Henderson returned from Tucson 3 days early, bringing with her disturbing news. Someone had written to her in Tucson, warning her that her nephew was spending an inappropriate amount of time alone with the Indian girl who worked in her house. The letter had been unsigned, but it had contained enough specific details to make it clear that someone was watching them closely. "I cannot have this kind of scandal associated with my household," Mrs. Henderson had told Ayanna coldly the morning after her return. "Your services will no longer be needed. I will send word to Father Mackenzie that the arrangement has not worked out." Ayanna had wanted to ask if she could at least say goodbye to Thomas, but she could see from Mrs. Henderson's expression that such a request would only make things worse. She had gathered her few belongings and walked out of the Henderson house with as much dignity as she could manage, her heart breaking with every step that took her farther from the man she loved. Thomas had tried to follow her, catching up with her just outside of town on the road back to the reservation. "This is not the end," he had told her desperately, taking her hands in his. "I will find a way for us to be together. I will write to you, I will come to you, I will never give up on us." "How will you write to me?" Ayanna had asked, tears streaming down her face. "There is no postal service to the reservation. How will you come to me?" "The soldiers will not let white men onto Apache lands without special permission that you will never get." "I will find a way," Thomas had insisted. "I swear to you, Ayanna, I will find a way. Watch for my letters. No matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult it becomes, I will get word to you. And, when I do, when I have found a solution to our problem, will you come with me? Will you trust me enough to build a life together despite all the obstacles?" Looking into his eyes, seeing the desperate love there, Ayanna had nodded. "I will wait," she had promised. "I will watch for your letters, and, when you find a way, I will come with you." They had kissed one last time by the side of the dusty road, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer force of will. But time had moved on anyway, and, eventually they had been forced to let go. Thomas had watched until Ayanna disappeared around a bend in the road, and Ayanna had not allowed herself to look back, knowing that seeing him standing there alone would destroy the small amount of strength she had left. That had been 3 months ago, and, in all that time, no letter had come. Every morning, Ayanna made her way to the creek to collect water, hoping against hope that this would be the day she would find some sign, some message, some indication that Thomas had not forgotten his promise. Every evening, she sat with her grandmother and tried to pretend that her heart was not slowly dying from the weight of disappointment and uncertainty. "You are waiting for something," Nazja had observed one evening as they sat together working on beadwork. "I can see it in the way your eyes go to the horizon, in the way you listen for sounds that do not come. What are you waiting for, granddaughter?" Ayanna had not been able to tell her grandmother the truth. How could she explain that she had fallen in love with a white man, that she was waiting for a letter that might never come, that she had made promises that might destroy her family if she ever tried to keep them? Instead, she had simply said, "I am waiting for the world to change, grandmother. I am waiting for a time when Apache people can choose their own paths instead of having paths chosen for them." Nazja had studied her granddaughter's face for a long moment, those ancient eyes seeming to see everything that Ayanna was trying to hide. "The world does change, little blossom," the old woman had said finally. "But it changes slowly, like the canyon walls that are carved by water one drop at a time. Sometimes we must wait for the change, and sometimes we must be the change. The trick is knowing which time you are living in." Now, as Ayanna finished filling her water vessels and prepared to return to the reservation, she wondered which time she was living in. Was this a time for waiting, or a time for action? Was Thomas really trying to find a way to contact her, or had he already forgotten the Apache girl he had loved for 2 brief weeks in the Arizona desert? Was love really strong enough to bridge the gap between their two worlds, or had she been foolish to believe in such an impossible dream? The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in harsh light that revealed every detail of the unforgiving landscape. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Thomas Crawford was going about his daily life in the white world that had claimed him. Somewhere in the mountains, Apache warriors like her brother Joseph were planning acts of resistance that would probably only bring more suffering down on their people. Somewhere in the reservation, her grandmother was preparing for another day of quiet endurance, keeping the old ways alive through sheer force of will. And, here, by the creek that marked the boundary between the Apache world and the white world, Ayanna stood with her water vessels and her broken heart and her stubborn hope, waiting for a letter that might never come, holding on to a love that might have been nothing more than a beautiful dream. But, even dreams, she reminded herself as she began the walk back to the reservation, were sometimes worth waiting for. And, until she knew for certain that Thomas had forgotten his promise, she would continue to wait, continue to hope, continue to believe that somewhere in the vast desert of impossibility, love might find a way to bloom. The autumn winds brought more than just cooler temperatures to the reservation that year. They brought rumors of trouble brewing in the mountains, whispers of Apache warriors who had grown tired of waiting for the white man's promises to come true. Joseph had been disappearing for days at a time, claiming he was hunting or visiting friends on distant parts of the reservation, but Ayanna could see the restlessness in his eyes, the way his hand automatically moved to check for the knife he kept hidden beneath his shirt. "There are men gathering," her friend Maria confided to her one evening as they walked together near the edge of the reservation. "Men who remember the old ways, who say they would rather die as warriors than live as prisoners. They say Geronimo himself might ride again." The name sent a chill down Ayanna's spine. Geronimo, the legendary Apache leader who had spent years fighting against white encroachment, had been captured and imprisoned more than once, but he had also escaped more than once. If he was truly planning another uprising, it would bring down the full wrath of the United States Army on every Apache reservation in the territory. "You must not speak of such things," Ayanna warned her friend. "The walls have ears, and there are those among our own people who carry tales to the white soldiers for extra rations." But Maria was not easily silenced. She was a year younger than Ayanna, but she had a fierce spirit that reminded Ayanna of her grandmother in her youth. "And what if they do hear?" Maria demanded. "What if the soldiers do come? What could they do to us that they have not already done? They have taken our land, our freedom, our children to send them to white schools where they are taught to be ashamed of who they are. What more can they take?" "They can take our lives," Ayanna replied quietly. "They can take our families. They can scatter us to reservations so far apart that we never see each other again. There are always things that can be taken, Maria. The question is whether what we might gain is worth the risk of losing what we still have." It was a conversation that reflected the growing tension throughout the reservation. The younger Apache men, like Joseph, were increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of change and the broken promises of government officials who spoke of education and assimilation but delivered only poverty and restrictions. The older people, like Nasja, counseled patience and endurance, remembering too well the devastating consequences of previous attempts at armed resistance. Caught in the middle were people like Ayanna, old enough to understand the complexity of their situation but young enough to still believe that change might be possible. She found herself walking a careful line between supporting her brother's anger and respecting her grandmother's wisdom, between hoping for Thomas's promised letter and accepting the possibility that their love had been nothing more than a brief dream. The waiting was made more difficult by the fact that she had no way of knowing what was happening in Thomas's world. Had Mrs. Henderson told her husband about the supposed scandal involving their nephew? Had Thomas's family in St. Louis learned of his inappropriate attachment to an Apache woman? Was he being pressured to leave Arizona altogether, or had he simply realized on his own that pursuing a relationship with Ayanna would be social and professional suicide? These questions tormented her during the long days and longer nights, especially when she lay awake listening to the wind howl across the desert and wondering if Thomas was somewhere out there thinking of her, or if she had already become nothing more than a memory of a foolish mistake he had made during his time in the wild western territories. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Ayanna heard Joseph slip out of their family's cabin. She waited a few minutes, then wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and followed him into the darkness. The moonlight was bright enough to show his tracks leading away from the cluster of buildings that housed the reservation's Apache families and toward the rocky hills where the old sacred places lay hidden from white eyes. She found him sitting on a flat rock overlooking the valley below, his face turned up toward the star-filled sky in the way their grandfather had taught them when they were children. "You should not be out here alone," Joseph said without turning around. "It is not safe for young women to wander in the darkness." "I am not wandering," Ayanna replied, settling herself on the rock beside her brother. "I am following my brother who seems determined to get himself into trouble that will bring suffering down on our entire family." Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a pain that Ayanna had never heard from him before. Do you remember when we were children, sister, how grandfather used to tell us stories about the time when our people could ride from the rising sun to the setting sun without ever crossing another man's boundary lines? I remember, Ayana said softly. Do you remember how he described the buffalo hunts, the way the entire tribe would work together to bring down the great beasts that provided everything we needed to live? Do you remember the stories about the warriors who could track an enemy for hundreds of miles, who knew every water source and every safe passage through mountain territory that white men still call impassable? I remember all of it, Ayana replied, though she was beginning to understand where this conversation was leading. Joseph turned to look at her then, and, in the moonlight, she could see tears glistening on his cheeks. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and, for just a moment, I forget where I am. I forget about the reservation boundaries and the government agents and the ration lines. For just a moment, I remember what it felt like to be Apache in the time when being Apache meant something. Being Apache still means something, Ayana said gently. It means being strong enough to survive when survival seems impossible. It means finding ways to keep our culture alive even when the whole world seems determined to kill it. It means being the grandchildren of people who were wise enough to bend without breaking. No, Joseph said, his voice becoming hard again. What we are doing is not surviving. What we are doing is dying slowly, letting them kill us one small piece at a time until there is nothing left of who we used to be. Our children speak English better than Apache. Our young men know more about plowing fields than tracking deer. Our women make white women's clothes instead of traditional dresses. We are becoming the people who destroyed us, and we call it survival. Ayana could not deny the truth in her brother's words, but she also could not accept his conclusion. And what would you have us do instead? Fight against an army that outnumbers us 1,000 to 1? Watch our children be slaughtered for the sake of pride? I would have us die as Apache if we cannot live as Apache, Joseph replied. I would have us remembered as people who chose their own fate rather than accepting the fate that was forced upon them. It was then that Ayana realized how far her brother had already traveled down the path toward violence. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice, feel it in the tension that radiated from his body like heat from a fire. Joseph had made his choice, and that choice would soon force her to make her own. There are men gathering in the mountains, Joseph continued, confirming what Maria had told her earlier. Good men, strong men who remember what it means to be warriors. They are making plans to leave this place, to return to the old ways of living. They have asked me to join them. And, will you? Ayana asked, though she already knew the answer. How can I not? Joseph replied. How can I continue to live in this cage when I know that freedom is still possible for those brave enough to reach for it? And, what of grandmother? What of me? What of all the people who depend on you to help them survive here? Joseph reached out and took his sister's hand, squeezing it gently. You are stronger than you know, sister. Strong enough to take care of grandmother, strong enough to make your own choices about what kind of life you want to live. I cannot make those choices for you, just as you cannot make this choice for me. They sat together in silence for a while, both understanding that this conversation was changing everything between them. When Joseph left with the warriors who were gathering in the mountains, Ayana would become the head of their small family. She would be responsible for her grandmother's care, for earning enough money to supplement their government rations, for navigating the complex politics of reservation life without the protection of her brother's presence. When will you go? She asked finally. Soon, Joseph replied. Within the week, I think. The leaders want to move before the weather gets too cold, before the army increases its patrols for the winter. Will I see you again? Joseph was quiet for a long time before answering. I do not know, he said honestly. The life I am choosing does not allow for many visits home. But I will carry you with me in my heart, sister, just as I will carry the memory of grandmother's stories and grandfather's wisdom. Sometimes that is the only way to keep the people we love safe. As they made their way back to the cabin through the moonlit desert, Ayana felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. With Joseph gone, she would need to find ways to provide for her grandmother that did not depend on seasonal hunting or the sporadic work that was available on the reservation. She would need to be both daughter and son, both caretaker and provider, both keeper of traditions and navigator of the new world that was replacing the old one. It was this realization that made her think once again about Thomas's promise to find a way to contact her. If he truly meant to keep his word, if he truly had found a solution to the impossible problem of their love, then his letter might arrive just when she needed it most. The money she could earn working in the white world would be essential for her grandmother's care, especially if Joseph's departure brought unwanted attention from government officials who might reduce their family's rations as punishment for having a relative who had joined the resistance. But, even as she held on to this hope, Ayanna knew that she was clinging to a thread that might snap at any moment. 3 months was a long time in the complex world of white society. Thomas might have been transferred to another bank, sent back to St. Louis, or simply forbidden by his family to have any further contact with the Apache woman he had once claimed to love. He might have tried to send letters that never reached their destination, or he might have discovered that the obstacles to their relationship were truly insurmountable. The next morning brought news that made all of these concerns even more urgent. Father Mackenzie arrived at the reservation earlier than usual, his normally cheerful face creased with worry lines that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "I have come to speak with the young women who have worked in town," he announced to the gathered families. "There have been developments that require some adjustments to our arrangements." Ayanna felt her heart sink as she listened to the priest's carefully chosen words. The developments he was referring to were almost certainly related to the growing tensions between the Apache people and the white communities surrounding the reservation. As reports of warrior gatherings spread, white families would become increasingly reluctant to employ Apache workers, no matter how reliable or skilled they might be. "The Henderson family has decided to hire a white woman to help with their household duties," Father Mackenzie told Ayanna privately after the general meeting. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to tell you that your work was satisfactory, but that they feel it would be prudent to make a change given the current climate." "I understand," Ayanna replied, though understanding did not make the disappointment any less painful. The job with the Henderson family had been her connection to Thomas's world, her only hope of receiving any message he might try to send. With that connection severed, she felt more isolated than ever. However, Father Mackenzie continued, "I may have another opportunity for you. The doctor's wife in Globe needs help with her medical supplies and patient records. It would require someone who can read and write well, someone who can be trusted with confidential information. The pay would be similar to what you earned with the Henderson family, but the work would be quite different." The opportunity was both a blessing and a burden. Ayanna desperately needed the income, especially with Joseph planning to leave and her grandmother growing frilier each month. But working for the doctor would mean spending time in the white community just when tensions were reaching their highest levels. It would mean walking through streets where Apache people were increasingly viewed with suspicion and hostility. "I am grateful for your help, Father," Ayanna said carefully. "When would I need to begin this new position?" "Monday morning, if you are willing," Father Mackenzie replied. "Dr. Morrison is eager to have someone start as soon as possible. His current assistant is leaving to get married, and he has several patients who require regular monitoring of their conditions." As Ayanna walked home from her conversation with Father Mackenzie, she felt as if she were standing at a crossroads where every path led into unknown territory. Joseph would soon leave to join the warriors in the mountains, choosing the path of resistance despite its almost certain tragic end. She could choose to take the job with Dr. Morrison, risking the dangers of working in an increasingly hostile white community but gaining the income her family needed to survive. Or she could choose to remain on the reservation, accepting poverty and dependence but staying safe within the boundaries that had been established for her people. That evening, as she helped her grandmother prepare their simple dinner of government-issued beef and beans supplemented with wild plants that Nazja still knew how to find and prepare, Ayanna tried to explain the choices that lay before her. "The world is changing around us very quickly," she told the old woman. "Soon we may all be forced to make decisions that we never thought we would have to make." Nazja looked up from the pot she was stirring, her ancient eyes studying her granddaughter's face with the intensity that had made her legendary among Apache women for her ability to see truth even when it was hidden beneath layers of deception. "You speak of change as if it were a storm that comes from outside," Nazja said slowly. "But sometimes the most important changes come from inside our own hearts. Sometimes we must choose not between the path that others have laid out for us, but between the person we have been and the person we are meant to become. I do not understand, grandmother. You are waiting for something, Nasja said, just as she had weeks before. I can see it in the way you listen for sounds that do not come, in the way your eyes search the horizon for signs that do not appear. But waiting can become its own kind of prison, granddaughter. Sometimes we must stop waiting for the world to give us what we want and start taking the steps that will create the life we need. That night, as Ayana lay on her sleeping mat listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in their cabin walls, she thought about her grandmother's words. Was she trapped in the prison of waiting, as Nasja had suggested? Was she letting hope for Thomas's letter prevent her from building a life that could exist without him? The questions followed her into her dreams, where she found herself walking through an endless desert, carrying water vessels that never seemed to empty but never seemed to quench her thirst either. In the distance, she could see two figures walking in opposite directions. One was Joseph, growing smaller as he moved toward the mountains where freedom and death waited in equal measure. The other was a man whose face she could not quite make out, but whose presence filled her with both longing and fear. Between these two figures, Ayana walked her own path through the dream desert, knowing that soon she would have to choose a direction, knowing that whatever choice she made would change everything about who she was and who she might become. The only question was whether she would have the courage to make that choice when the time came, and whether the choice she made would be guided by fear or by the kind of love that her grandmother had always told her was worth any risk. The morning that Joseph disappeared from the reservation forever, Ayana woke to find a small piece of turquoise on her sleeping mat. It was a stone that had belonged to their grandfather, passed down through generations of Apache men who had worn it as protection during hunts and battles. The fact that Joseph had left it for her rather than taking it with him into the mountains told her everything she needed to know about his expectations for his own survival. She held the smooth stone in her palm, feeling its warmth and weight, understanding that it represented more than just a family heirloom. It was Joseph's way of passing the responsibility for preserving their family's heritage to her. It was his acknowledgement that while he had chosen the path of the warrior, she would need to find her own way of keeping their people's spirit alive. Nasja said nothing when Ayana showed her the turquoise stone, but the old woman's eyes filled with tears that she quickly wiped away before anyone else could see them. They both knew that Joseph's departure would bring unwanted attention from government officials who kept careful track of which Apache men were present for the weekly roll calls. Questions would be asked, searches would be conducted, and their family would be marked as potentially rebellious. We must be very careful now, Nasja told her granddaughter as they prepared for what would undoubtedly be a difficult day. There will be those who want to punish us for Joseph's choice, and those who want to use us to gather information about where he is gone. We must be strong like the desert willow that bends but does not break, wise like the coyote that survives by being cleverer than its enemies. The old woman's predictions proved accurate. Before noon, Agent Davidson, the federal official responsible for managing the San Carlos reservation, arrived at their cabin with two soldiers and a list of questions about Joseph's recent activities and possible destinations. Your brother has violated the terms of his residency here, Davidson told Ayana in his clipped, bureaucratic tone. Any Apache who leaves the reservation without official permission is considered a hostile and will be treated as such when captured. If you have any information about his plans or whereabouts, it is your duty to share that information with the proper authorities. Ayana met the agent's cold stare with the kind of steady composure that her grandmother had taught her to maintain in the presence of white officials. My brother told me only that he felt called to spend time in solitude, seeking guidance from the spirits of our ancestors. He did not tell me where he was going or when he might return. It was not exactly a lie, since Joseph had indeed spoken of seeking guidance, though they all knew he had sought it from living warriors rather than ancestral spirits. The distinction was important to Ayana's conscience, even if it would mean nothing to Agent Davidson if he ever learned the truth. Seeking guidance from spirits, Davidson repeated with obvious skepticism. That's a convenient excuse for joining the renegades who are causing trouble throughout the territory. I hope for your sake, Miss Ayana, that your brother's spiritual quest does not involve raiding supply trains or attacking white settlements. The consequences for his family would be severe. The threat was clear enough. If Joseph was captured or killed while participating in raids against white targets, Ayana and Nasja could find themselves relocated to a distant reservation, stripped of their rations, or worse. The government's policy of collective punishment for Apache resistance was well established and ruthlessly enforced. After the officials left, Ayanna and her grandmother spent the rest of the day in tense silence, both understanding that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated. The small amount of protection that Joseph's presence had provided was gone, leaving them vulnerable to any neighbor who might want to curry favor with the authorities by reporting suspicious behavior, or any official who might want to make an example of a family that could not be trusted to keep its members in line. It was in this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that Ayanna made her final decision about Dr. Morrison's job offer. She could no longer afford the luxury of refusing work simply because it required her to spend time in the white community. With Joseph gone and their family under official suspicion, the extra income from working in town was no longer just helpful, it was essential for their survival. Monday morning found her walking the familiar road to Globe, but everything felt different now. The landscape looked the same, the dusty path wound through the same rocky hills and desert scrubland, but Ayanna felt as if she were walking through a foreign country where the rules had changed overnight. Every white person she encountered on the road seemed to look at her with increased suspicion, every conversation she overheard seemed to contain references to Apache troublemakers and the need for tighter security. Dr. Morrison's office was located above the town's general store, a two-story building that had been constructed with the solid craftsmanship that suggested its owner expected Globe to be a permanent settlement rather than the temporary mining camp that many Arizona communities turned out to be. The doctor himself was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of careful, methodical manner that inspired confidence in his medical abilities. "Miss Ayanna," he said when she arrived for her first day of work, "Father Mackenzie has told me wonderful things about your intelligence and reliability. I hope you will find this work both interesting and rewarding." The job proved to be more complex than anything Ayanna had done before. Dr. Morrison treated a wide variety of patients, from mining injuries and childhood diseases to the chronic conditions that affected many of the older settlers. Ayanna's responsibilities included maintaining detailed records of each patient's symptoms and treatments, organizing the doctor's supply of medicines and surgical instruments, and helping to prepare patients for examination or treatment. Many people assume that medical work is simply a matter of applying the right treatment to the right disease, Dr. Morrison explained as he showed Ayanna how to organize his patient files. But the truth is that medicine is as much about understanding people as it is about understanding illness. Every patient brings not just a set of symptoms, but a unique history, a particular set of fears and hopes, a specific way of experiencing pain or discomfort. The doctor's words reminded Ayanna of her grandmother's approach to traditional healing, which also emphasized the importance of understanding the whole person rather than just treating specific symptoms. It was one of the few things that made her feel at home in the white world, this recognition that healing required wisdom about human nature as well as knowledge about remedies. Her first week of work passed without major incident, though Ayanna was constantly aware of the suspicious looks she received from some of Dr. Morrison's white patients. Most people accepted her presence without comment, apparently trusting the doctor's judgment about his choice of assistant. But there were a few who made their displeasure clear through cold stares and whispered comments about the wisdom of trusting important medical information to an Indian. It was during her second week that Ayanna encountered the most significant challenge yet. Mrs. Thompson, the wife of one of Globe's most prominent mine owners, had brought her young daughter in for treatment of a persistent cough that was not responding to the usual remedies. Dr. Morrison was away from the office, delivering a baby at a ranch outside of town, leaving Ayanna alone when the woman arrived for her appointment. "Where is Dr. Morrison?" Mrs. Thompson demanded when she saw Ayanna preparing the examination room. "I did not bring my daughter here to be treated by an Indian. The doctor is attending to another patient," Ayanna replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "He asked me to prepare for your daughter's examination and to take note of any changes in her symptoms since your last visit. I will not have my child touched by Apache hands," Mrs. Thompson declared. "Everyone knows that Indians carry diseases that civilized people can catch from contact with them." The accusation was both medically ignorant and deeply insulting, but Ayanna forced herself to respond with the same professional courtesy that Dr. Morrison had taught her to use with all patients. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Thompson. If you would prefer to wait for Dr. Morrison's return, you are welcome to do so. In the meantime, I can take notes about any new symptoms your daughter has developed." Mrs. Thompson's prejudices might have caused a serious problem if not for the intervention of another patient who had been waiting to see the doctor. Mr. Williams, an older man who suffered from arthritis that Ayanna had been helping to treat, spoke up from his chair in the waiting area. "Now see here, Mrs. Thompson," he said in the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This young lady has been nothing but professional and helpful since Dr. Morrison hired her. She's probably forgotten more about medicine than most folks in this town ever knew. If you want to act like a fool, that's your business, but don't expect the rest of us to support your ignorance." The public rebuke from a respected member of the white community left Mrs. Thompson with little choice but to either accept Ayanna's assistance or leave without receiving treatment for her daughter. After a moment of tense silence, she grudgingly agreed to let Ayanna take notes about the child's symptoms, though she insisted on sitting as far away from her as possible and refused to allow any direct contact between Ayanna and her daughter. The incident left Ayanna feeling both grateful for Mr. Williams's support and deeply troubled by the reminder of how precarious her position was in the white community. One false accusation, one moment of conflict with the wrong person, and she could find herself not only without employment but potentially in serious legal trouble. It was this awareness of her vulnerability that made the conversation she overheard later that week so disturbing. She was organizing medical supplies in the back room of Dr. Morrison's office when she heard voices from the main examination room, voices that belonged to Agent Davidson and another man she did not recognize. "The problem is that we still don't have enough reliable information about renegade activities," Davidson was saying. "We know there are warriors gathering somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains, but we don't know their exact location or how many men they have with them." "What about the families?" the other man asked. "Surely some of the reservation women know where their men have gone." "Most of them claim ignorance," Davidson replied with obvious frustration. "They say their relatives spoke only of spiritual quests or hunting trips. Either they're telling the truth, which I doubt, or they're better at keeping secrets than I gave them credit for." "There are ways to encourage cooperation," the stranger suggested. "Reduced rations, relocation threats, separation of families. Sometimes a little pressure can produce remarkable results." "I've considered those options," Davidson admitted. "But they have to be applied carefully. Too much obvious coercion and we risk pushing more men into joining the renegades. The goal is to isolate the troublemakers, not create more of them." Ayanna felt her blood turn cold as she listened to the casual discussion of tactics that could destroy Apache families. These men were talking about using hunger and fear as weapons against people who had already suffered so much, and they were doing it with the same detached professionalism that Dr. Morrison used when discussing surgical techniques. "What about the girl who works here?" the stranger asked suddenly. "The one whose brother recently disappeared. She might know something useful." "Ayanna," Davidson said thoughtfully. "I've questioned her already, but she claims ignorance. She could be telling the truth, or she could be protecting her brother. Either way, she's worth watching." "Watching how?" "People talk around domestic help," Davidson explained. "They forget that the Indian girl cleaning their house or organizing their papers might be listening to conversations that could provide useful intelligence. If we keep track of what she hears and who she talks to, we might learn something valuable." The realization that she was being used as an unwitting spy against her own people filled Ayanna with a mixture of rage and terror. Every conversation she overheard at Dr. Morrison's office, every piece of information she gained about white community activities, could potentially be used against Apache families. She was being watched not just as a potential source of information about her brother, but as a means of gathering intelligence about the broader white community's plans and attitudes. When the men finally left Dr. Morrison's office, Ayanna remained in the supply room for several minutes, trying to calm her racing heart and organize her chaotic thoughts. She was trapped in an impossible position, caught between the white world that employed her and the Apache world that needed her protection from that same employment. That evening, as she walked back to the reservation, Ayanna made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. She could no longer afford to wait passively for Thomas's letter, hoping that love would somehow solve the problems that were threatening to destroy her family and her community. She needed to take action to protect herself and those she cared about, even if that action meant giving up her dreams of a life beyond the boundaries that had been established for her people. When she reached her grandmother's cabin, Ayana found Nazca waiting for her with the kind of knowing expression that suggested the old woman had been expecting difficult news. "The world is closing in around us," Ayana told her grandmother without preamble. "They are watching me, using me, planning to use what I hear and see against our people. I cannot continue working in town if it means becoming a weapon against my own family." Nazca listened carefully as Ayana described the conversation she had overheard, nodding occasionally but saying nothing until her granddaughter had finished speaking. "You are learning wisdom, little blossom," the old woman said finally. "You are learning that sometimes the price of survival in one world is betrayal of another world. This is a lesson that many Apache people have had to learn in these difficult times." "But what am I supposed to do?" Ayana asked desperately. "We need the money I earn in town, especially now that Joseph is gone. But I cannot continue to work there knowing that everything I do might be used against our people." Nazca was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that provided both warmth and light for their evening meal. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of difficult decisions and painful compromises. "There are times when a person must choose between what is safe and what is right," she said slowly. "Your grandfather faced such choices when the soldiers first came to our land. I faced them when they took our children to the white schools. Your brother faced them when he decided to join the resistance. Now it is your turn to face such a choice. And what choice should I make?" "That is not for me to decide," Nazca replied. "But I will tell you this. The choices that we make when we are afraid often turn out to be different from the choices we make when we are brave. The question you must ask yourself is not what choice will keep you safest, but what choice will let you look at yourself in the mirror without shame." That night, as Ayana lay on her sleeping mat thinking about her grandmother's words, she found herself remembering Thomas's promise to find a way to contact her. 4 months had passed since that promise was made, 4 months of waiting and hoping and gradually losing faith that love could overcome the obstacles that separated their two worlds. But, perhaps, she thought as she drifted off to sleep, the absence of Thomas's letter was itself a kind of message. Perhaps it was telling her that she could not build her life around waiting for someone else to solve her problems, that she needed to find her own solutions to the challenges that faced her and her people. The turquoise stone that Joseph had left for her seemed to grow warm in her hand as she held it, as if it were absorbing the heat of her newfound determination. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that an Apache woman could be strong enough to protect her family and wise enough to navigate the dangerous waters between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. But tonight, for the first time in months, Ayana fell asleep without listening for sounds that might indicate the arrival of a letter that would never come. Instead, she dreamed of paths she might forge for herself, of solutions that did not depend on anyone else's promises, of ways to be the eternal blossom that her grandmother had always believed she could become. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried not by the postal service that did not extend to Apache reservations, but by a young Mexican boy who approached Ayana while she was gathering firewood near the creek. The child, who could not have been more than 12 years old, handed her a folded piece of paper and spoke quickly in Spanish before disappearing into the brush as suddenly as he had appeared. Ayana stared at the letter in her hands, her heart pounding so violently that she could barely breathe. After 5 months of waiting, 5 months of gradually convincing herself that Thomas had forgotten his promise, here was proof that he had not abandoned her after all. The paper was fine quality, the kind used in banks and other important businesses, and her name was written across the front in the careful handwriting that she remembered from the notes Thomas had sometimes left for her during their brief time together. But, even as relief and joy flooded through her, Ayana felt a strange reluctance to open the letter immediately. So much had changed since Thomas had made his promise to contact her. Joseph had disappeared into the mountains, possibly forever. She had lost her job with the Henderson family and found new work that put her in an impossible position between two worlds. Most importantly, she had begun to build a life that did not depend on rescue by a white man who might not truly understand the complexities of her situation. Still holding the unopened letter, Ayana made her way back to the cabin where Nazca was preparing their morning meal. The old woman took one look at her granddaughter's face and immediately understood that something significant had happened. "The thing you have been waiting for has finally arrived," Nazca observed, nodding toward the letter in Ayana's hands. "Yes," Ayana replied, settling down beside the fire. But, now that it is here, I find that I am afraid to read it. Afraid of what it might say, or afraid of what you might feel when you read it? The question forced Ayanna to examine her own reluctance more carefully. Was she afraid that Thomas's letter would contain disappointing news, evidence that he had given up on their relationship or found it impossible to overcome the obstacles that separated them? Or was she afraid that his letter would contain exactly what she had been hoping for, forcing her to choose between the life she had been building and the dreams she had been nurturing? Both, she admitted finally. I have learned to live without hoping for this letter. I have found ways to be strong that do not depend on someone else's promises. Now I am afraid that reading his words will make me weak again. Nasja stirred the pot of corn mush that would serve as their breakfast, her movements slow and deliberate as she considered her granddaughter's dilemma. Strength and weakness are not as simple as they appear, she said finally. Sometimes what looks like strength is really fear in disguise, and sometimes what looks like weakness is really the greatest courage of all. I do not understand. When you refuse to read the letter because you are afraid it will change your feelings, that is not strength. That is fear of your own heart. But, when you read the letter and, then, choose your path based on wisdom rather than emotion, that is true strength. With her grandmother's words echoing in her mind, Ayanna carefully unfolded the letter and began to read. The handwriting was definitely Thomas's, though it looked less steady than she remembered, as if it had been written under difficult circumstances or great emotional stress. My dearest Ayanna, the letter began, and just seeing those words written in his familiar hand brought tears to her eyes. I know that 5 months have passed since I promised to contact you, and I know that you may have given up hope of ever hearing from me. I can only pray that this letter finds you well and that you will forgive the delay that was beyond my control. The letter went on to explain the obstacles that Thomas had encountered in trying to communicate with her. Shortly after their separation, his uncle had discovered the true nature of his relationship with Ayanna and had threatened to have him arrested for violating territorial laws regarding relations between white men and Indian women. To protect both himself and Ayanna, Thomas had been forced to agree to a transfer to the bank's branch office in Tucson, where he would be under close supervision and where any attempts to contact Apache women would be immediately reported to the authorities. I have spent these months searching for a safe way to reach you, the letter continued, and I have also been working to find a solution to our situation that would allow us to be together without bringing danger to either of us. I believe I have finally found such a solution, though it will require great courage from both of us and sacrifices that we must carefully consider. Thomas's solution was both simpler and more complex than anything Ayanna had imagined. He had been in correspondence with a colleague from his college days who now worked for a bank in San Francisco, California. This friend had agreed to help Thomas secure a position in the California banking system, where territorial laws regarding Indian and white relationships were less restrictive and where a mixed couple might be able to build a life together without constant fear of legal persecution. If you are willing to take this risk with me, the letter continued, I can arrange for you to travel to California under the protection of a family who have agreed to employ you as a domestic worker during the journey. Once you reach San Francisco, we could be married under California law, and I could find work that would support us both. It would mean leaving your family and your people, possibly forever, but it would also mean freedom to love each other without hiding or fear. The letter concluded with the practical details of the proposed plan. If Ayanna agreed to the arrangement, she should send word through the same Mexican boy who had delivered the letter, and Thomas would arrange for the traveling family to pick her up at a predetermined meeting point outside the reservation boundaries. The journey would take place within the month, before winter weather made travel more dangerous and before Thomas's transfer to San Francisco became permanent. I know that I am asking you to give up everything familiar for the sake of a love that has been tested only briefly, Thomas wrote in his closing paragraphs. I know that you have family responsibilities and cultural ties that make this decision agonizing. But I also know that some opportunities come only once in a lifetime, and if we do not seize this chance to be together, we may never have another one. When Ayanna finished reading the letter, she sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process the emotions that were flooding through her. Joy that Thomas had not forgotten her, relief that he had found a potential solution to their problems, and terror at the magnitude of the decision he was asking her to make. What does the letter say? Nasja asked gently. Ayanna read the letter aloud to her grandmother, translating the English words into Apache so that the old woman could understand the full implications of Thomas's proposal. When she finished, they sat together in silence, both understanding that this was one of those moments that would divide Ayana's life into before and after, regardless of what decision she made. "He is asking you to choose between your people and your heart," Nasja said finally. "Yes," Ayana replied. "But it is not as simple as that. If I stay here, what kind of life can I build? Joseph is gone, probably forever. You are growing older and will need more care. The government agents are watching me, using my work in town to gather information against our people. Even if I give up the job with Dr. Morrison, what opportunities exist for an Apache woman on the reservation? And if you go with this white man to California, what kind of life would that be? Would you spend the rest of your years pretending to be something you are not, hiding your Apache heritage from neighbors and colleagues who might reject you if they knew the truth? Would your children grow up knowing nothing of their mother's people, thinking of themselves as white and feeling ashamed if they ever learned otherwise?" The questions her grandmother raised were ones that Ayana had already been considering, but hearing them spoken aloud made their weight even more apparent. Either choice would require enormous sacrifices, and either choice could lead to regret and loss. "There is another consideration," Ayana said slowly. "If I disappear from the reservation now, when the authorities are already suspicious about Joseph's departure, it could bring serious consequences for you and for other Apache families. Agent Davidson is looking for excuses to increase restrictions or reduce rations. My disappearance could provide him with the justification he needs." "That is true," Nasja acknowledged. "But you cannot sacrifice your entire life to protect other people from consequences that may or may not occur. Sometimes a person must choose her own path, even when that path is difficult for those who love her." Over the next 3 days, Ayana wrestled with the decision that would determine the rest of her life. She considered every angle, every possible outcome, every argument for and against accepting Thomas's proposal. She thought about the life she could build in California, free from the restrictions and prejudices that constrained Apache people in Arizona territory. She thought about the life she would be leaving behind, the grandmother who had raised her, the community that had shaped her, the cultural traditions that gave meaning to her existence. She also thought about love, about the rare and precious connection she had discovered with Thomas during their brief time together. Was that connection strong enough to sustain a marriage built on the sacrifice of everything else she held dear? Was love alone sufficient foundation for a life that would require her to reinvent herself completely? On the third night after receiving the letter, Ayana made her decision. She would not go with Thomas to California, but neither would she simply ignore his offer. Instead, she would write him a letter explaining her choice and the reasons behind it. Using paper and ink that Dr. Morrison had given her for keeping medical records, Ayana composed what she knew would be one of the most important letters of her life. She wrote in English, knowing that Thomas would understand the effort it required for her to express her deepest feelings in a language that was not her own. "My dear Thomas," she began, "your letter brought me both great joy and great sorrow, joy that you have not forgotten me, and sorrow that the solution you have found requires me to choose between your love and my people's need. I have thought carefully about your proposal, and I must tell you that I cannot accept it, though my heart breaks to write these words." She went on to explain the reasons for her decision, the responsibilities she could not abandon, the cultural connections that were too important to sever. But she also tried to help him understand that her refusal was not a rejection of their love, but rather an acknowledgement of its limitations. "I love you enough to want you to be happy, even if that happiness must be found without me," she wrote. "I love you enough to be honest about who I am and what I need, rather than pretending that love alone can solve all problems. And I love you enough to set you free to find a woman who can give you the kind of life you deserve, a life that does not require either of you to sacrifice everything you are for the sake of being together." The letter concluded with a request that Thomas not try to contact her again, and a promise that she would always treasure the memory of their time together while building a life that honored both her heritage and her dreams. When the letter was finished, Ayana gave it to the same Mexican boy who had delivered Thomas's message, along with a silver bracelet that Joseph had made for her years before his payment for his services. As she watched the child disappear into the desert carrying her words of goodbye, Ayana felt both profound sadness and unexpected relief. She had made her choice, and, while it was not the choice that her heart wanted, it was the choice that her wisdom and her conscience required. That evening, as she sat with her grandmother working on the beadwork that told stories without words, Ayana began to understand what Nasja had meant about the difference between strength and weakness. Choosing love at any cost would have been the easy path, the path that followed her emotions without considering the consequences. Choosing duty at the expense of love would have been equally easy, requiring only the suppression of her feelings. But, choosing a path that honored both love and duty, that acknowledged the validity of her feelings while accepting the impossibility of acting on them, required a different kind of strength altogether. It required the strength to live with longing while still building a meaningful life, the strength to accept limitation while still pursuing dreams, the strength to let go of what could never be while holding tightly to what still might be possible. As the weeks passed and winter settled over the desert, Ayana threw herself into the work of building a life that could exist without the love she had chosen to sacrifice. She continued working for Dr. Morrison, but with a new understanding of how to protect herself and her people from the political implications of her employment. She began teaching Apache children to read and write in both English and their native language, helping them navigate between two worlds without losing their connection to either one. Most importantly, she began to see herself not as a woman waiting for rescue, but as a woman capable of creating her own salvation. The eternal blossom that her grandmother had seen in her began to bloom not in the garden of romantic love, but in the harder soil of service, courage, and the kind of wisdom that comes only from choosing the difficult path because it is the right path. The letter that had never come had finally arrived, but by then, Ayana no longer needed it to define her future. She had learned to write her own story, and it was a story worth telling. Spring came early to the Arizona Territory that year, bringing with it news that would change everything for the Apache people and for Ayana herself. Word filtered through the network of traders, soldiers, and government officials that Geronimo and his followers had finally been captured after months of pursuit through the rugged mountains of Arizona and Mexico. The last great Apache war was over, and, with it ended any realistic hope of returning to the old ways of life that Joseph and other young warriors had died trying to preserve. For Ayana, the news brought both relief and devastating sorrow. Relief because the capture of the Apache resistance meant that the heightened suspicions and restrictions that had made reservation life even more difficult would finally begin to ease. Sorrow because she knew that somewhere in those distant mountains, her brother Joseph had almost certainly met the same fate as the other warriors who had chosen death as free men over life as prisoners. The world our grandfathers knew is truly gone now, Nasja said as they sat together in the evening after the news had been confirmed by Agent Davidson himself. Our people must find new ways to be Apache in a world that has no place for the Apache way of life. The old woman had grown noticeably frilier over the winter months, and Ayana could see that the grief over Joseph's disappearance was taking its toll on her grandmother's spirit as well as her body. At 83 years old, Nasja had lived through more changes and losses than any person should have to endure, and the final defeat of Apache resistance seemed to drain something essential from her will to continue fighting for survival. "You must promise me something, granddaughter," Nasja said that night as they prepared for sleep. "You must promise that when I am gone, you will not waste your life mourning for the world that is lost. You must find ways to keep the best parts of our heritage alive while building something new, something that can survive in the world that is coming." Ayana wanted to protest that her grandmother would live for many more years, that there was no need to speak of such things. But she could see in the old woman's eyes the same acceptance that had carried her through decades of impossible circumstances. Nasja had made her peace with the approach of death, and she was using whatever time remained to ensure that her granddaughter would be prepared for the challenges ahead. It was with this conversation still fresh in her memory that Ayana received an unexpected visitor 3 days later. Dr. Morrison arrived at the reservation in his medical wagon, accompanied not by a patient seeking treatment, but by a woman Ayana had never seen before. She was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed in the manner of educated Eastern women, with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence that reminded Ayana somehow of her grandmother. "Miss Ayana," Dr. Morrison said after greeting her formally, "I would like you to meet Miss Catherine Hartwell. She has come from Boston to establish a school for Indian children, and she has some questions about your experience with education." Miss Hartwell shook Ayana's hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in a world dominated by men. Dr. Morrison tells me that you are one of the most intelligent and capable women he has ever known, regardless of race or background. He also tells me that you have been teaching Apache children to read and write in their native language as well as English. I have been helping some of the children with their studies, Ayanna replied cautiously, uncertain where this conversation was leading. What Miss Hartwell is not telling you, Dr. Morrison?